screen.
Yeah. James is monitoring all that on his notebook over there. So the idea is this is to help teach folks not only about Jamstack a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a sort of a recap of what Jamstack is, but really how do you sell this and teach folks about Jamstack and Headless CMS, teach it to your peers and your managers, and kind of sell this internally?
Yeah, it is a very new way of looking at things. So, we're still, it's sort of past the early adopter phase, and now people are really starting to take notice. But I think, it's still sort of up to everyone who is into this technology and really buys into it to go and sell it to somebody else. Tell a friend and get involved, because we really do think this is the future.
Yeah. Just going to double check that I'm on the right microphone here. We're good. It's all good. All right. Cool. Technology is good. So the idea too is we're going to help you design a migration path from something like a traditional site to a Jamstack site. And, what are some of the technologies and sort of techniques for doing that?
Yeah. And I think because one of the problems is it's like, okay, let's say you've actually bought into the concept of Jamstack already, and you're like, okay, I want to have a static website. I want to take advantage of these features. The problem is if you already have an existing website, you don't want to have to rebuild it all from scratch. That's a huge project. So that's going to take a long time. If you want to start using these and seeing these benefits now, we're going to try to show you a way where you can actually do this without rebuilding your site. Is that right?
Yeah, because that's the biggest excuse, right? Oh, I need to rebuild my whole site. It's much easier if I just keep adding on to what we already have, because I can do that. It's what I'm used to and whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're trying to get around in this case. So let's get started. And I think this is the most important slide that we have is we're all in this together. We're all learning this technology. It's pretty new. So there are no bad questions. Please ask us questions. Please interrupt. And hopefully James will catch it as people do. If you have it coming through your screen, hopefully we'll see when that happens. If you're watching this as a recording on YouTube, feel free to connect with us on Twitter or just in the comments on YouTube there, and we'll try to get back to you on those. All right, let's get started for realsies. About us. We're going to do the thing where I introduce you, you introduce me?
Yeah, sure. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Joel Varty, President of Agility CMS, the big dog himself.
Whoa, careful.
Joel's actually been, one of my mentors for 7 years now since I joined Agility as a junior support developer. Yeah. So I've learned a ton of things from this guy. He's a father. He's a published author. He also coaches football.
That's right.
The modern day Renaissance man. This is Joel Varty.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. Wow, this is kind of embarrassing. Actually, I feel my face going red as you talk about it. Now it's time for you to blush. So this is James Vidler, our VP of product. Also runs our customer support team as well. And to describe James in one word, I would say hungry. Not only because he hasn't had lunch yet, but because he's hungry for knowledge. And actually, I have to credit you for bringing Jamstack as a concept to Agility to me. And I'm pretty sure I poo-pooed it pretty hard when I first saw it. I'm like, this is ridiculous. There's no way this is going to work. Talk about JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't run on the server like
static
that.
Site. The whole purpose is to have a dynamic site, right?
Yeah.
It takes a bit to wrap your head around.
So I really credit you with that, but not only for bringing the idea, but for sticking with the idea. And if anyone is good at teaching other folks, or should be teaching other folks how to sell this, it's you, because you sold it to me as an idea. And then we sort of went through our organization talking about that. So this is one of the reasons why it's an exciting topic, because it is a new technology that I really feel that we should get behind. And you've done a great job of that so far.
Cool. So thank you. Well,
here we go.
Hope to continue.
So let's talk about what Jamstack is. I feel like we have to do this for a while. We have to keep talking about sort of what it is, teach about what the Jamstack is and what it means.
Yeah. So we're going to hammer it home. If you've heard this before, bear with us.
Yeah. And we're going to hopefully find better ways to describe this, because I don't think we've done a good job of it so far. So at its bare minimum, Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And really, in terms of us as a vendor as Agility CMS, we're one of the APIs. We're the content API that helps to get into your site, to get the content into your website. And the other parts are the JavaScript and the markup.
Yeah, and all those three pieces come together to sort of deliver the concept of Jamstack. But you also might be asking yourselves, well, why is Agility, who is only really one small piece of this puzzle, talking about APIs, talking about Jamstack? Well, the reason is because this is still a fairly new thing, and we want to help educate everyone else about it so that they can start using these things and take their benefits. So yes, Agility plays a small role in this, which is just the APIs. But in order to sort of give you the whole picture, we really need to show you guys, here's a sample site how to get started off with different frameworks, different markups you can use, different types of JavaScript, and of course, different ways you can set up hosting environment, and we'll go through some of that stuff.
Yeah, we really love educating people about this. It's really one of our missions and goals, is to educate people, not just to learn stuff, but how to teach other people how to do it. So that's Jamstack at its basic. Most basic. What you almost always end up talking about in terms of Jamstack are the frameworks that are used in support of that. And the most popular one, I think, is React. So, 75% or something of the world's developers know JavaScript. And of that huge, proportion of those developers, a majority of those are already coding in React. React's been around for a long time.
Yeah, and I remember when I sort of first heard about React, this was, I don't know, probably back in like 2013 or something like that. And someone was explaining it to me, and I was like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. But, at the time I was building a ton of websites, and I really struggled to think, okay, how can I build a site that uses React to output stuff on the front end and handle all the functionality while still keeping your site search engine optimized. Mm-hmm. And that was always a sort of challenge. And then, people eventually moved to the terms of like isomorphic apps, which run some code on the back end or some JavaScript in the back end and JavaScript on the front end in real time. That gets a little messy, but yeah, React's been around for a long time, but until I've seen it actually work with static site generators, that's when it really sort of clicked with me as saying, okay, this is cool, because running React on a server in real time is always a little scary.
Right. So yeah, and we'll get more to talking about where your code's actually running in a second. One of the things, if you're not sure about how to talk about React basically takes everything, including the markup. So JavaScript is, JavaScript API markup in Jamstack. It takes everything and put it into the JavaScript. So it puts your code in terms of your HTML right in your JavaScript, as well as your CSS as well.
Right. So if a React site, if you're just building a site with React just on the front end, if you actually disable JavaScript, nothing is actually going to appear at all.
Yeah, so unless it's statically generated. So there are a few other frameworks that are popular. We're not going to talk about all of them, but one of them that I think is, if not the second most popular, it's the second most growing sort of framework, is called Vue, or Vue.js, which takes a slightly different approach to a framework where it has templates and has JavaScript that drive those templates and CSS. So it actually splits the different pieces of content up in a slightly different way into components.
Yeah, the way I look at this too is there are two ways to accomplish a lot of the same thing. And you'll see a lot of technologies out there that integrate with React or Vue. It's just a different flavor.
Yep. Yeah, and they both use something called the virtual DOM to actually manipulate it and make it easy to do UI. Another one that's been around, I think, for even longer is called Angular. This is like, I think we're on coming up to version 8 or 9.
I can't keep up anymore.
We actually put it in third place because there aren't as many static site generators that are mature out for Angular. There's a brand new one called Scully that we're not talking about right now. But there are some really mature static site generators that work great with Jamstack for React and Vue. But of course, there's the purists out there who are all about vanilla. So I don't want to use any framework at all. Just want to write vanilla JavaScript. And yes, there is a place in the world for you. We didn't talk about jQuery here because there's still people that say, hey, I still use jQuery. And I would put that in the vanilla camp. So if you're just want to use straight vanilla or maybe some jQuery to help you out, that's okay. It's not new, but it's part of the people in what I'd say in the vanilla camp.
Yeah, I would say in the vanilla camp. But the point we're trying to get across here is, we're talking about React, Vue.js, Angular. These are different ways, different sort of foundational code you can use to help you build static sites. You can still build it with vanilla JavaScript as well. So if you're in that camp, there's something for you too.
Yep. Okay. Has anyone raised their hand or anything? Were we able to check that? Oh, good. Okay, cool.
Yeah, keep going.
All right, let's just press forward. So The next part of the conversation inevitably leads to static site generators, where you were talking earlier about, normally JavaScript, we think of it as something that runs on the browser in terms of these front-end frameworks like Node and React, React, but then you have something like Node, which is an idea of running JavaScript on the server. So these are frameworks where we're gonna run a bunch of code on the server to output static HTML, right? Which is what we talked about in the previous webinar. The most popular one, I think, at this point, is going to be Gatsby. It's one of the most talked about sort of things, and it's growing really fast. It is built on top of React. It uses GraphQL internally, so you don't have to use GraphQL APIs to work with it, but it does have its own GraphQL engine that it works with. And they also have a fairly new offering called Gatsby Cloud, which is brand new, that allows you, is really how they're monetizing the platform. So Gatsby itself as a technology is open source, but they have a thing called Gatsby Cloud that'll run your preview server and your build server for you. Yeah,
it's really, they give you a build pipeline and the ability to preview stuff in a way that works great out of the box for Gatsby sites. You can always roll your own for these, but Gatsby Cloud just makes that a lot easier. But to your point, one of the reasons why we are really big fans of Gatsby, and I personally have actually spent a lot of time doing some R&D with Gatsby and building a source plugin to make sure that if you're using Gatsby, you can source all of your content from Agility just sort of automatically, and then you just sort of pick the data that you need with GraphQL. But one of the great things about that is it's great if you need to actually source data from a bunch of different data sources. So like Agility CMS is just one data source, but you might have information from YouTube or something like that you might want to bring in, like metadata around your YouTube videos, or if you have your own internal API that is exposing some things too. So as opposed to being a developer building new functionality, having to learn how to use each one of those APIs individually, you can actually download a source plugin, which will go ahead and source that content for you all before it actually gets combined with your markup. And as a developer at that point, you're just sort of picking and choosing what queries you want to run, what columns you want to grab, and then you can sort of mutate those into exactly what you want. So it makes it one unified interface to be able to actually work with your data, which is really, really cool. I don't believe there's any other static site generators out there that do the same thing. A lot of the other implementations aside from Gatsby will require you to essentially within a function be able to go and source the data that you need for a specific case, and you need to know how to use the APIs for each one of those things.
And I think Gatsby is really, you say the word opinionated a lot. It's opinionated about how you get your data into there to make these plugins. The good thing is all those source plugins, they're all open source. So you can go and see how other people did it. And then, okay, well, they did it that way for their data. That's how that's working. And then I could use that for my data. So it's one of the ways you can learn is they're really big on the open source, community. So that's a big part of their success. The next one that I think it's been around actually for a little bit longer and it's really popular. It's called Next. It's also based on React. And then in terms of the monetization of this platform, which they're also doing, they have a service called SiteNow, which is pretty new and really exciting. And you've had some interactions.
Yeah, I've played around with it a little bit, and it's funny. Next.js and Gatsby kind of have the same story. They both started as these open source frameworks, ways of doing things. And actually, they both kind of started off as ways to how do we solve the problem of using React and having a site that's SEO friendly. That's kind of how it started off, and how we got this sort of concept of static site generation. And those libraries really took off in the open source community. And but now, of course, they've grown to such high popularity that they're actually getting investment now in building cloud services to actually better support their frameworks. So if you are using Gatsby, if you are using Next, Next has, similar to what Gatsby has, SiteNow, which does a little bit more than what Gatsby does. It does your builds for you, but it also does your deployments. It also has these things around server-side, around serverless functions, which is cool. I won't get into too much around that for now, but really cool stuff that's coming out from Next. It's a lot less opinionated than Gatsby. So, if you don't want to use the concept of plugins or GraphQL and you just want to call an API to get your data and just pass it to your front end, that can also work quite well for you too.
Right. So yeah, these are frameworks where they've said, this is the problem we're solving. And they've done a lot of work over the last few years. I mean, Gatsby has been around since 2015. Next has been around since before that, I believe, to help you solve these problems. So they're doing a good job at getting on well on the road to getting that problem solved. Yeah. There's another platform called Nuxt, which is very similar to Next, that is based on Vue. And I think one of the things about Next and Nuxt, even though they're incredibly similar, is you can run the site in multiple modes. So you can run the build that does complete to static generation. You can run it in server mode so that it runs everything live on a server.
Right, so that it actually runs JavaScript on the server in real time when a request comes in.
Right.
Which it can be a little scary, but in some cases you might want that or need it, I suppose.
Yeah, almost too many options, but it lets you do it. Or you can run it in what's called SPA mode, which is like an application. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, they're pretty flexible about what you want to do and give you a lot of options about how to do that. Now, those are based on React and Vue. What if you're in the vanilla camp and you don't want to use a framework, or you have a ton of HTML out there that has no framework on it? Maybe you're just using jQuery, maybe it's really old, but you want to get some dynamic data like from a CMS like Agility into it. What can I do? You can use, there's a really simple static site generator called 11t, which I was playing around with the other day, and I was blogging about that on DevTO. It's vanilla, it's super simple, and it allows you to, it's basically just a templating engine that has routing and some other stuff. Right. It's really, really simple, and it doesn't use any framework at all. It allows you to use any templating framework that you want, things like handlebars or Liquid, really simple to use. I really enjoyed working with it. That's
interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. I haven't used that one yet. So going back to our sort of, what is Jamstack? Talk about JavaScript APIs and markup. What roles do these, these companies that we just talked about, or these frameworks, what role do they sort of play in that?
Yeah, I'd say these are the leaders of the JavaScript community. The folks, if you look at guys like Kyle Matthew, the CEO of Gatsby, he is one of the leaders in saying, this is how we think people should be solving the Jamstack static site problem. And then building tools around making that easier for developers to work with. So I think it's worth kind of following these stories. And it's also, we're at a chance where I think these are not new technologies anymore. They are what I call crossing the chasm, is a common term. So like we're seeing enterprise type companies wanting to use these technologies.
Right. And so these really, take the role of, these provide the JavaScript and the markup to help you build your site. Yeah. We provide the APIs.
You got it.
All right, cool.
Cool. So that's a bit of a sort of a grounding on those sort of some of the players involved. Let's do a little bit of a refresher on what we mean by static site generation, because I think the biggest thing here, we talked about it in the previous webinar, instead of running my site on a web server, I'm going to have a build server that generates my site for me. So here we have a build server that could be, and it could be a cluster as well. So one of the things that Gatsby Cloud does is that actually it doesn't just use one machine, it does it on a cluster to do it like 20 times faster than if it was running, on a single server. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So they have that built in. So what the idea is, we're going to take the code that's written, so the React and whatever code that's all compiled in there. It's going to run that on the build server, and it's going to take your content, which is sourced from these dynamic APIs. It's going to combine that in a build and output the static HTML, CSS, for your JavaScript for your site. Okay, so that's everything that needs to run that site.
So that end result there, static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where does that sort of exist? Where does that go?
Well, it's a build. It's a folder, right? So it gets built into like a folder where it has all it in there. So it's just files at this point. And that's where you were saying, so the code that ran on the build server, that's running on a server, then it gives you all this other code that's now just files. You then have to put that somewhere.
Right.
You still have to host it on the internet.
Yeah, but it could be on a static
file
storage, similar to a place where you would store images or something like that.
That's right.
Okay, cool. And we're talking about a build server here, and just for those that don't know, like when would that build happen? What scenarios, like why do you need a build process to update content on your site?
Right. So it's a good question. So in normal DevOps, we have, we're going to be building our code that we wrote. It could be written in PHP or C# or Java or whatever that's going to run on my server. But in this case, in a traditional CMS sort of standard setting or whatever, your content wouldn't be part of that build process. The content would be, injected after or put together at runtime. In this case, my content is part of my DevOps. So that it had to get built as, just like you would normally compile code, it's like compiled into that static HTML.
So then that means for anything to get updated in my sort of static HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, that sort of build, if anything to get updated there, it has to go through a build process, right? Yeah. So that means that build process can happen when there's changes to code that happen that need to be deployed.
Yeah.
or if there's changes to content that need to be updated on the site as well.
Yeah. So it kind of leads us to the idea of, well, then our users need to understand, like people who are editing content in a CMS, they need to understand that part of the process. And we need to be sort of better at talking about DevOps in that way.
Right.
But the good thing is that if I had tests that were running as part of that build process, my content now participates in those tests. So if I broke those tests, so you talk about the Lightspeed tests, the page speed test that can happen. If I had something that said, hey, I put in an 18 megabyte JPEG in my content that somehow got through the build, my page speed test would probably fail on that and say, no, this is no good, and then it wouldn't get pushed to live to the site.
Yeah. Actually, I'll just catch you guys up. We were talking about this earlier, but one of the things I found out the other day was that those Google page speed scores that you put your URL to and you get a score, and most people are not happy with the score and they want to do better. Obviously, Jamstack can help with that. But what's actually really cool is you can actually run those audits, those called Lighthouse audits. You can actually run those audits in a continuous integration pipeline. So then that means, if we're looking at Jamstack and, your site has to go through a build process anytime anything gets updated on the site, including just content, you could actually have those audits run automatically, and only if it passes those audits should it actually promote to production. So yeah, it certainly gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of when you want to decide your production site gets updated. But yeah, it's also a challenge to be able to explain this to regular everyday editors who are, very used to the world of, I save something, I hit publish, it's automatically live on the website. So it is a bit of a different conversation that needs to be had. But I think involving the editors into that conversation early and getting their sort of buy-in on that process to understand how it works, and they can put their input as well, I think can really help you lead it to better results. Because there's a bunch of different ways you could set up these pipelines. Yeah. And but I think it's important to get buy-in from everyone that's going to be working on it.
Yeah, and it's certainly like DevOps, people working in DevOps that specialize in that. That's a new role that has kind of come about in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, where that's somebody's job. Yeah, pretty much to maintain and make those continuous integration processes better. So this is the DevOps for static site generation. So we get to the point now where we talk about, well, why should I migrate? This is where we get to the teaching aspect. Why should I migrate to Jamstack, and how do you sort of take that message into your organizations? It could be, it could be that it's your organization needs to actually, it's your site that needs to get updated, or maybe you're a developer yourself and you want to try to push this through into your organization for sites that you're building. So there's a lot of things you can talk about. I would try not to talk about too many things at once. This is why we have lots of webinars. I would pick the points that are important to you and your organization, talk about those, pick 3 or 4. So easiest one to talk about is better page speed and reliability. And you can talk about those lighthouse tests. I don't know, I get that wrong. Those lighthouse tests. So, the time to first byte tends to be way faster. There's no web server to maintain or upgrade, those sort of things. It's more reliable.
Yeah, the idea that you can have a sort of site that is essentially versioned, right? Because any change you make needs to be updated. So you end up having a version site that is immutable. It can't change without it going through a build process. So that makes it a heck of a lot more reliable. I'm not going to say 100% uptime, but if you want to get 99.99999, you can probably hit that with a site like this. And I guess we can talk about scalability here too, right? You don't have to worry about, because with traditional dynamic sort of websites, you have to worry about, how is this going to scale well? If you have a page that looks up something from a database or an API and you're returning content, that needs to be run on every single page request. And so it might be fine if you have 10, 100, 1,000 users maybe using your site at once, but then all of a sudden you get, some campaign goes out and your site goes viral, which is great. That's what you want. And then it takes down your website because it can't handle all of those requests coming to one thing. Having those static files sitting there means that those are always going to be available, and nothing's going to change there, which is going to cause that to go down. And there's no compute performance required to render the pages. So you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have a site that can scale, and it's probably infinitely more cheaper as well because of that. Yeah,
lots of ways to talk about that, and it's just it's just simpler. All the things you were mentioning are actually, especially on a Friday, making my heart pound. Because it's like, it's got to scale up with more servers and, load balancing and all those, you just don't have to worry about those.
The amount of conversations I've been involved with applications that don't scale well, or, run into runtime issues or that kind of thing. Those can all just be completely eliminated actually if you're just following this process.
Yeah.
So that's what really excites me.
We could spend a lot of time talking on webinars about stuff like that. I think one of the most exciting things for a developer is you have better possibilities for UX. So, one of the things that I've found with sort of big monolithic older sites, they've been around for a long time, and people will say, oh, it looks like a site from 2005 or whatever. Right. And kind of hard to get to put a new maybe CSS or JavaScript framework in place to kind of get some more, different front-end type components that you might want to use. So what happens is you get a website that has jQuery and React and Vue all jammed in. You have this 5 megabyte JavaScript bundle that gets added to it, and that's just nasty. Yeah,
you end up having to sort of jam in these things to your existing site, and you're not really starting from a fresh slate.
It's not the JAMstack we were talking about. You don't want to jam it in. Yeah, and I would say that, these are actually the way we've talked about JAMstack is usually we start from a framework that does give you a lot of UX capabilities and components and lots of best practices out there.
Yeah, and then some do better jobs of that than others. We talked about some of the previous frameworks like Gatsby, Next, Nuxt, and Eleventy. Yeah, we talked about those four as examples. Gatsby is a lot more opinionated, so it does a lot of things automatically out of the box for you that just sort of sets you up for using best practices for your user experience. It handles a lot of accessibility things and forces that on you and throws all kind of crazy errors in your face when you don't do that right.
That's right.
We talked about, actually, I don't think we talked about this, but Gatsby also provides a image component, which you should just use if you're using a Gatsby site, and it'll automatically sort of immediately load a very, very, very low, couple kilobyte version of your image. And then it'll actually blur in the actual full one just afterwards when the users sort of scroll down to that area on the screen. So plus on top of that, it'll only serve images for the size of the actual device that you're on. So if you're on a mobile device and you're not loading up a big image that's supposed to be on desktop and then compressing that down into a little thing, you're actually just loading the image specifically for the size of your screen. So it does all that stuff sort of out of the box, but you still have to use it. Right?
Yeah, the UX on these sites is just a lot better. Yeah, and then there's a lot of reasons for it.
You're also giving developers who are actually responsible for implementing your front end the tools that they want to use and the tools that they can be very productive at. We've seen students that come out of a 3-month boot camp and they know Gatsby already, and they're able to create a super fast, beautiful looking website for something that would normally take someone else a lot longer than that and a lot more experience to be able to actually perform.
Yeah. Whereas if I'm a backend developer or a full stack developer, and my specialty is in like databases and APIs, I can focus on that side of things. And I don't have to worry about it because personally, a lot of backend developers, kind of like me, not so great with latest CSS frameworks and JavaScript frameworks, and keeping on top of that stuff is really hard. Whereas I'm, somebody like a full stack developer, get them doing the backend database and API work, and then have, get that data into where we can give it to the front end developers. Yeah. So this is all good stuff. It can simplify your workflow and your DevOps. So we talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked about DevOps, how your content and those APIs, the things that come in through the APIs are now part of that DevOps. And this workflow is just sort of clearer in terms of how things are getting from code and content that's being worked on outside of the website. How does that get into the website?
Right. Yeah. So I'd agree that it's a simpler process because you're saying at this point you're combining your code and your content, and it's just like updating a file. Like you want to update your website, you just update a file.
It's no more magic, no more background magic.
But I will say this, because there are so many different ways to set up your DevOps pipeline now. Now it's a little bit different. So now there's some thought that should go into that process that maybe you just took for granted before because there was only one way to do it before. So we could probably do a whole nother webinar really just talking about different ways you can set up your DevOps. But of course, if you guys want some advice or whatever, ping us, let us know. We're happy to help.
Yep, for sure. So the fourth one, we're only going to do 4 points here because I only have 4 fingers and 1 thumb on a hand. It's more secure. You talked about it being more reliable and faster, but I think more secure is one of the ones. This is a big hitter. Standard sites are vulnerable not only because of the things that people know about, but also because of all the attack vectors and all the different things that are yet to be discovered about how to attack a PHP site
running
or whatever.
On, like if you have a website that's running on a server, it's running on an operating system.
That's right.
right? And and it's also running on an application, which is running on that operating system. So you have all these different levels of things you don't even see. So your website can be super secure and you could spend all your time on your website, but the hosting environment you're on could have a vulnerability there where a hacker can get in, start messing some things with your server. So there's just the surface area for attack is just that much larger.
Yeah, fewer attack vectors is the terminology.
Attack
that,
vectors.
yeah, we see it right there. It's like, yeah,
I remember that one.
yeah. So it's just way more secure, and that's a really good thing. So let's talk about how, because you said before, we still need to host these things. So we have a build process with DevOps and other things. We need to now take the static files and put them somewhere.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of different ways we can do that. There's a couple more standard ways. So, where Agility is all about Azure, we're 100% hosted on Azure. Azure has the ability to host static sites. So it uses something called Blob Storage, and you can use Azure CDN, which is a bunch of different offerings there, or you could use some other CDN on top of that.
What is just to get this? What is Blob Storage? Just so that everyone knows.
Like big hard drives on the internet kind of thing.
All right. So like a bucket to just store.
Yeah. But you can hit them
Okay.
over HTTP as well. So you could actually put the site on Blob Storage, make it public, and that would work. I would say that's not Jamstack as far as I'm concerned, because there is so much value to get for having it on a CDN. That's what makes it fast. That's what makes the time to first byte really, really low.
Right. So it's almost like instead of Jamstack, it's almost like you want to call it like JavaScript APIs markup and static hosting and CDN. But then that's too many acronyms.
Yeah, I stopped listening after Jam. So yeah, I think that what Jamstack has kind of evolved as we've seen like what are the best practices and the best sort of things. So we can use Azure with Blob Storage and Azure CDN. We can also use AWS. Those are two of the big players for cloud cloud computing. The AWS has something called S3, so a simple storage service.
So that would be like their version of Blob Storage, same thing, right?
Yep.
Okay.
I should have actually the reverse because S3 came first. And then they have a product called CloudFront, which is their CDN. Okay. Now those are really low level. We'll talk about more about those in a second. There's two other sort of options that I think are really useful. One is called Nullify, which is a super exciting company to follow right now.
Yeah.
And I sort of in my mind, when I think of Nullify, I think they have a build service. So that's one of the things they provide. They have edge compute plus CDN. So they're really, really exciting. So, you can basically just take your static files, put them up there, and they have the idea, they keep track of those atomic builds you were talking about. So I put one version up and they have another version that I did later. It keeps track of that for me.
Yeah, and actually one thing a lot of people may not realize is that Nullify was actually the ones that coined the term Jamstack. So they've actually built their entire product with Jamstack in mind. So it is, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably one of the best hosting platforms specifically for Jamstack sites because they're designed for it.
Yeah.
And plus, they just got $53 million in investment.
Congratulations, Nullify.
They're Series C funding. So yeah, congratulations. And that's just going to show, how much people have really bought into Jamstack. It's not just something that is, maybe coming or might flame out. People are investing a lot of big bucks in this because they certainly see the potential there. I know Google has also invested some money into Jamstack as well, just to make the internet a better internet, a better, more stable internet.
The fourth one, I should say, is one called the SiteNow, which you don't hear much about, but you've done some research about this and talked to.
Yeah, I mean, like it's also quite popular, but it's just Nullify has really just like they own the Jamstack SEO essentially, right? So I think if you're looking for a Jamstack host, they're going to come up top of the list all the time. But yeah, SiteNow is also another great alternative. It works really well specifically with Next.js websites, but you can also host any other static site on there too.
Yeah, let's dig into these a little bit. So we put Azure and AWS sort of in the same sort of thought process. They are, I call, and they're in the battle of the titans. So there definitely has been for the past 10 years a feature for feature competition and price competition between these two different providers. And they provide some pretty great services that you can get infrastructure as a service, you can get platforms as a service but they're still pretty low level, I would say. So, in terms of the storage and the CDN, they're pretty low level offerings. You have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, you really got to piece these things together. Personally, I've set up a few Azure environments myself. Haven't done one in Amazon yet, but I have spoken to a colleague who has. And yeah, you got to know what you're doing. There's a lot of specific configuration stuff you're setting up because if there's no sort of one-click set up my hosting environment for me, they're not tailored specifically for Jamstack, but of course you can use them for
Yeah, and we're starting to see some higher level offerings. So AWS has a service called, I think it's called Amplify, which you can jump on to sort of, it will help you do a lot of your DNS settings and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. They're getting a little higher level. So I expect more from those companies soon, but they're there. Let's talk about, we already started diving in a little bit to Netlify, but what it has. I think the most exciting thing initially with Netlify is the idea of these atomic builds, where you have a versioned copy of your website at that time. That's how you sold it to me when you first started talking about it.
Yeah, so that means anytime you deploy something to Netlify, it keeps a previous version of it and it gives you a unique URL for each one. So that means you can deploy something, immediately get a URL that you can send to a colleague that is unique just for that build, just for that change that someone can review, and then you can decide to promote that to production.
And it actually has CLI commands to promote things to production, so I could work that into my DevOps to have like approval in the DevOps to say, is this build good, or test that build. Really, really useful. It has edge delivery, so it's already on the CDN. What I love is about as soon as you build it, you don't have to go like clear CDN cache or anything. It just does it for you.
So Netlify handles the builds for you, right?
Yeah.
Handles builds for you. It'll also give you a place to store your files, and it also deploys those to URL endpoints on a CDN. It kind of does a lot of stuff for you.
They just take care of that. That's like the base functionality. And then they start adding other functionality on top. So they give you the ability to do serverless functions. So if I want to write, and some people might think of these as Lambda queries. So like small chunks of JavaScript that can give you, they can go out and do server to server functions for you, basically.
Yeah.
So they give you that.
And so, I guess that's one thing we haven't really talked about a lot here, but serverless functions is an interesting point. Again, we could probably do a whole webinar on that too. But, when you're building a static site, there's no way to dynamically change your content really, unless you're doing it in JavaScript after the page is loaded. But what happens for cases where you need to like make a form submission that goes and stores something in a database somewhere? You don't have a place to actually write that code. You're not going to write that in JavaScript and expose your private API to the internet. You're going to want to have some sort of service in the middle. So Netlify is sort of recognizing that, hey, developers are going to be building these static sites. They're going to need a place to easily just set up these sort of, one-off endpoints where they need to be able to maybe post data to, and it maybe needs to do something behind the scenes. So they're really starting to fill that gap and providing serverless functions out of the box.
Yeah, and then you talked about the ability to do form submissions. Well, they said, oh, that's another one. So another value add-on, you can do instant forms. So you build this form thing and just basically, I think you put the word Netlify in there. Boom, it'll submit it to your Netlify backend. So there's more things coming. They do analytics, they do all kinds of stuff. So it's a great service with lots of stuff sort of evolving within it. We also talked a little bit about SiteNow. And I think one of the things is it's the same company that built Next. So it's amazing for Next.
Yes. Good for other things too, but specifically designed for Next. They take a different approach than Netlify a little bit in terms of like the way that they handle serverless functions. They essentially take your app and put it on a CDN, and then every sort of page route, page URL or like API route that you might have on your website gets broken down as a serverless function. So what's cool about that is that you can actually build a static website that on some URL paths, when it gets called, actually does run some code in real time. So that gives you a lot of flexibility to have a static site, but also have some parts of your site that actually do run code in real time, all on the cloud in serverless functions, which means, again, you have no servers to maintain, and you pay on demand for how many times those functions get executed.
Right.
So really cool stuff there. If you're into Next.js, check them out.
Yeah, they also have this idea of preview hooks, which is a kind of
a new feature that is coming down the line. I can't talk about it too much. I've been sworn to secrecy a little bit, but they're also providing a way sort of out of the box to be able to have sort of one environment and be able to preview that environment or be able to see the published version of that environment, which is very much how Agility CMS works with ASP.NET websites. But with sites like Gatsby and things like that, you kind of have to have a different preview environment and a different production environment entirely. They're trying to sort of merge that and make that a bit simplified.
Yeah. And then the idea of incremental builds is a thing. So I think this is something we've heard talked about with something like Gatsby, where they can do this, but Next has that.
Yeah, Next takes a different approach because, again, every one of your pages is essentially a serverless function. So you can decide when to invalidate the cache and get it to run that function again to output your HTML. So it's not exactly incremental builds, but it's like you can control when you want to refresh your content.
Yeah. So we'll do another webinar at some point just on Next, I think, because there's a lot to talk about there. Okay, so we've learned about JAMstack. Yeah. We're really excited. We started talking about it. We can educate folks in our organizations about, you know, what it is.
Yeah, we just talked about a bunch of frameworks and, you know, ways to different providers to host your site and everything. But yeah, let's get down to it. How can I actually start using this on an existing website while taking advantage of all of these services?
Yeah, and you know, so like, what's your excuse for not using it, right? Well, we talked a little bit about it. You know, oh, it's going to be too much. I've got this big site, this big project. I don't want to do the whole thing in JAMstack, especially since JAMstack's so new. What if I don't like it?
Well, and I can tell you from experience, you know, the last thing I want to hear from, you know, people that report to me is, hey, I want to rebuild this thing from scratch and do this thing on this new platform. I'm going to say, whoa, hold your horses.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's one excuse. Yeah.
Yeah, but there really are no excuses. Just do it. As Marge Simpson says, just go do it. So let's see how we can do that without having to rebuild everything. Because we believe in evolution versus revolution as a concept here at Agility. One of our goals, sort of for everyone, you should never have to rebuild your website from scratch again. That's one of the sort of things that we're trying to help the world get to as an idea. You want to be able to incrementally build on your investments.
Yeah, and you know, it's cool that we come from that place because we're providing essentially your backend data, right? We're providing the content that can help really power your website. And the idea is if you have that built in a smart, intelligent way, your front end and your front end technology and how that works in the front end, pretty much all the stuff we're talking about here can change all the time. Yeah. But you can keep a lot of this, your sort of content infrastructure that you've already set up in the CMS. Yeah.
So yeah, going hand in hand with that concept, how do you use JAMstack without rebuilding everything? Let's look at some techniques for doing that. So normally with a static site, the browser requests resources from a CDN, right? Super simple, and it's going to serve those from the static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that we talked about. So that's fine. But what if we could?
So that's an example of a JAMstack setup. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Right. But what if in between the CDN and the static HTML files, what if we could actually put some logic there to actually inject some kind of some way of running
smart.
It's not a server.
Sort of smart logic a little bit.
Yeah. Now the idea, they're called service workers. There's a few different terminologies that different providers use for them. But the idea is now we have some logic that we can run before the CDN requests my thing from a static file, right?
Right.
So what if we can be smart enough to know when to serve the static site and then decide, ooh, I want to serve the legacy site and the rest of the time.
Right, because that's really the end picture that you kind of want to get to, right? It's like I have my current site. I don't want to scratch that and rebuild everything because it's going to take me forever.
Yeah.
And so I guess the idea here is you're saying you keep the legacy site as is, but then be able to stand up a separate site, completely sort of isolated in the sort of Jamstack style with your whatever framework of your choice. And then you're saying, so you then have some logic that, you know, when an incoming request comes to your website, it then decides which sort of website behind the scenes it actually gets to, right? But does the URL like change? Does the domain change or anything like that? Like,
no.
Do you have to use subdomains?
No.
None of that?
No, the idea would be, so if it's, you know, www.mysite.com and I wanted to have, you know, a certain page on that come from a completely different, you know, maybe from my static site or whatever, I can mix and match how that works because everything is still going to get routed through that CDN. And CDNs also have sort of DNS rules that are in play there. Right. So some CDNs actually take over our DNS. Sometimes we can use CNAMEs, whatever.
Right.
So there's some setup to say that this website name is coming through this CDN, and then those service workers do the rest of the work in the back behind the scenes.
Wow. So I can really have one domain that powers, you know, 2 or maybe even more websites.
It's a little mind blowing, actually. So when you actually start to visualize it, I spent a lot of time working on these slides to sort of try and make it simple, and hopefully this works. I'd like some comments on whether people have different ideas of whether we could simplify this as a concept. So if we just look at the service worker, it's going to say, hey, most of the time I'm going to go to the legacy website because I've only done maybe my homepage, my stats page. I've got some stats page or something, and maybe everything under a certain microsite that's like a subfolder, like we're going to be doing for events for our own site. maybe that will go under static HTML, pull from a static site.
And I guess if I was actually designing like a migration myself, I would probably look at, what are my top landing pages on my site? Because those are the ones you want to be super fast, right? You want to get people to not bounce away. So you actually might go through the exercise of saying, okay, what are the sort of top 10 pages that I want to move over to this model, and then be able to start from there.
Yeah. Get started and find where you can get the quickest wins. Because usually the biggest pain points are the things like they've got terrible page speed scores. If you've got like something that's really bad, and it's usually a homepage, because those are usually really heavy, or landing pages.
Well, it's the page where you just add all your content that you want people to see, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I want them all to be above the fold. How do I do that? Yeah. So this is the sort of high level concept. How can we actually implement this? There's a few different ways. So there's some. So now we've talked about hosting providers. These are what we call edge services, or CDN type providers that can help us out with this.
These are like smart CDNs that can sort of like route your traffic to where you want it to go.
Yeah, and every CDN is getting smarter. So, but these are the ones that we really like to work with so far. And I'm sure that other ones will learn more about how they're evolving as they sort of evolve faster. One of them is called Statpath.
Yeah.
Pretty new service.
And we actually use Statpath. So we have some experience in that. That actually, we use Statpath's CDN for our REST API, actually.
Yeah. So really great service. They actually bought Max CDN, which is an old CDN provider that you might have seen, like jQuery serve.
Yeah, they used to serve all those jQuery URLs from I remember that. Yeah.
So it's pretty good service. It's got all those sort of edge services and service workers built in with a lot of other sort of DNS rules. Yeah. It's pretty cool. Cloudflare, I would say that Cloudflare and Stackpath are in like a feature battle kind of thing. Very, very similar services, similar in pricing. They both have service workers that will show later.
And they're both incredibly cheap, super cheap. Like actually, Cloudflare has like a free tier that allows you to do a whole bunch of stuff without even paying anything yet.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure if you get to a site that has a whole bunch of traffic, it gets either some cost associated, but it's still like fractions of the cost of running, a bunch of
pretty great services.
Servers,
I have a lot of respect for Cloudflare as a company because they pioneered a lot of this stuff,
right.
I believe. And they have a lot of free services out there to help make the web faster and more secure. So pretty cool company. Nullify is also, they're an edge service. So not only are they a hosting provider that you can use to sort of host your stuff, but they also have a lot of these edge services that I'll look at. And they've really simplified it. And then you have SiteNow, which also, as you said,
which also has the ability to do those things.
Yeah. So these are kind of multi-providers where not only do you host it, but they also have those edge services in place. Yeah. And I have two different examples of how to do this. So this is, we've come to almost the end of the thing, whereas you can show this is the really cool code. And I've simplified this code, but what I'm going to show you is some service worker code, which is written in JavaScript that basically says, well, let's go through it. So you get a JavaScript function that brings your request in. So we're kind of like we are a little mini web server here.
Right.
But these are very limited functions. They can't do very much and they have to work fast. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the URL that comes in. And it's what I'm saying is, hey, if it's under like the /posts URL, then I'm going to go to, look at the font got messed up. But anyway, I'm going to go to mystatic-site.com and pull that from there. Okay, so I might be on like, mywebsite.com.
Right, okay.
Right, that's the normal URL. And I have an example of this I'll show you.
Yeah.
So it's actually going to proxy this site through the CDN.
Yeah, and this code runs sort of like at the edge. So on the CDN, and from what I understand of the CDN works, there's sort of edge locations all over the globe, and this sort of runs at those different edge locations.
That's
so
right.
If a request comes in to any edge location, this little code gets run. Does this add some sort of like latency to your request? Like I'd imagine like a request has to come in, then it has to go make another request. So there must be some.
That's how CDNs work anyway. So what they're really doing, CDNs always work with something called an origin server. And so really your static site host files, whether they're on Blob Storage or wherever they are hosted on like a hard drive on the internet kind of thing.
Right.
That's the origin. So a CDN always has to say, go get the file from the origin and cache it in the CDN layer at the edge.
Right.
What this says is go get it from somewhere else. It's actually really simple.
Right. You're just sort of dynamically changing what the origin is for those. Oh, okay, gotcha. Right.
Now I can run other logic here, and these service workers are used for a lot of different things. And there's tons of documentation on how to do that. But this is literally proxy my everything under the posts folder from a different spot. And I could write lots of logic in here to do different sections, different pages of the site from different spots. And I'll demonstrate this in a second. But if we're using something like Nullify, they've actually even simplified it further. They have something called rewrite rules in a file called _redirects, where you just basically have a table of these things. So in this case, if I wanted to do, there's the posts example. So, hey, if I'm in the posts folder, go get everything from legacysite.com, right? And it's got this 200 rule to say proxy it. So we can do a redirect. So it could say actually change the browser URL. But if you give it a 200 as a status code, it will actually go proxy it for you and just take care of it.
Right. So, I mean, to me, if I'm not a developer, this looks a lot easier to manage than whatever you just showed me, right?
Yeah.
But are there some differences and limitations of one versus the other? Like this one, it seems like you can only do certain things, whereas the other one, the code is your code and you can do what you want. So what about a case where you have a site, let's say you have your legacy site, you have a new site. Your new site is you're going to build new ways to display your blogs, let's say. But you don't have the time yet to sort of redo your header and your footer. So you still want to show the new website when someone goes to see a blog post, but you still want to show the header and the footer from the old site.
Yeah.
Would I be able to do that using sort of like these redirect rules you have in here, or I'd have to sort of write custom code to do that? What would that look like?
Yeah. So if I'm going to go back a slide here.
Yeah.
So if I was to go back and I would use a service worker for that. There's also an old technology called Edgeside Includes, which you could look into. The internet has kind of gone away from those, where you can actually put tags in there that will do that for you. Oh. And a lot of these like Statpath and Cloudflare, they still support those. Right. So you can use Edgeside Includes to say, hey, this is the thing that pulls in my header content. This is the tag that pulls in my footer content. Or whatever, or different sections in between, and then I can inject the rest of the file in the middle.
So it means like an incoming request can actually pull content from two different can pull markup from two different websites and combine them together.
Well, in here, you see we've got this fetch call. I can make multiple fetch calls in here. And as long as they're all quick, then I'm fine.
Right.
And you can these also have the ability to store things, like to cache other stuff in a key value store. So I could go get the header and cache it in like a key value store that's actually on the edge.
Right.
So now we're getting into a little bit more like kind of web server-ish type things, but there's limitations about the simplicity that they can do, but it's really, really useful. And so these kind of conversations are stuff you can do. I want to just switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to actually show what this looks like in an example. So I'm going to switch to Chrome here. Hopefully this works. So this is actually the Agility CMS website. I can find my cursor here. I hope everyone can see this fine. But it's actually, I've got this proxied through testagilitywebsite.publish with agility.com. And what I've done is, and I can regularly go through here and it's fine. It's all the same stuff works as it normally would, and it loads and everything. Except what I've got is I've said, hey, for my posts, everything under posts, go to this other website, which is actually our demo Gatsby site. But you can see that the URL hasn't changed, right? Yeah. But it's showing me my posts, and I can actually, since everything underneath the posts folder is routing through, it just works.
So how did you set this one up? Is this using sort of like custom JavaScript that's doing this, or this is using a Nullify redirect?
So so this one is using Statpath. So this is using a Statpath service worker, and I've got a CNAME set up to route this through Statpath. Okay. Right. But I can actually go the other way as well. So I've got another one where I started from a site that was in Nullify. So this is my,
So they think of this way: someone builds this cool fancy new site using Jamstack, and like, hey, I have this site, and then they're like, now I want to implement this into your old site. That's kind of the approach you took here, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you can do it from either way. So this is where I wanted to use Nullify rewrites. So under here, I've got this is our Gatsby starter site that I've demoed for lots of different folks, and it's got whatever all set up. It's all good. It's fast. But if I go to a URL called, and this one, I set up resources. So if I hit the resources URL, notice my URL doesn't change up top, and it goes and pulls in the resources section from agilitycms.com. So you can actually go and scrape from any website because it's making a fetch request, right? So you can go and pull in something from your legacy site and pull it into here and do whatever you want. So you can mix and match however you think you should for your site. So it's really, really powerful.
So when you say scrape, you can essentially serve someone else's website under your own website.
Well, you could always do that, right? Like you could always go and make a request and serve it through. I mean,
don't do that with any banking websites.
I'm not sure that. Yeah, totally. Like, don't do that.
Work.
Not recommending. I say you do this for your own properties only. But it's super powerful. And now the sub benefit you get here is your legacy website is now being served through a CDN. So those service worker rules, you can also set up caching rules based on that too.
Right. So if your old site's slow, you can then start caching those things, especially older pages that are never going to change.
That's right. That's right. So we've done this to solve sort of scalability problems where someone has old code that they don't want to update. Put the site through the CDN is like step one. Step two, let's start doing Jamstack builds for certain pages that are really heavy. So I'd say that's a really great migration path. Once you sold the idea of, and I find that these ideas go really hand in hand. We don't have to rebuild the whole site. Hey, look, here's this awesome technology called JAMstack that we can use.
Cool. So you got my brain thinking a little bit here. I did think about there is an alternate way you could potentially integrate your Jamstack site. I think I'm going to say it's the wrong way, but like this is the other way to do it would be to keep your existing website code for your legacy site and just like create a folder in there, and then your Jamstack site is within that folder.
You could totally
do that too.
Yep.
I don't think that's a very good way of doing it. It sounds kind of hacky to me because you're then just adding more code to your big monolithic website that you're probably never going to get away from. Right?
Yeah. I would only do that in the case where there is no other option. We can't get through a CDN.
Yeah.
We can't change the DNS, but I wish you hadn't even talked about it because it was the first one that was brought up when I talked about this with a customer one time.
That they're like, oh, I can just do that.
I just push this. I just do a copy star into a folder.
So no, don't do that. Right? That's
I wouldn't do it, but it is a possibility. Like I'm not going to tell you not to copy files around because it's what we do. There are some other gotchas here. One of the things here, it's not just the pages that are important on our website, right? So I just showed you changing the page routes, but there's also like, what about the CSS and all that other stuff? Where are those coming from?
Right. So if you want to share CSS across the different websites kind of thing,
you're going to have to think about how to do that. So, and it's not that hard. And usually, you set up the initial rules and you tested it on a test domain. And it's like, oh, wait, all my CSS files are broken. I got to figure out how to do that.
It really comes down to just like being more mindful of the path names that you use, because when you're in a website that you think is the root website, but really it's a folder within I don't want to say folder, but it's within another website. You need to be mindful of the sort of relative links that you use. That's right.
So there's going to be CSS, there's JavaScript, that are images that are going to be used in those other resources. You got to make sure that those get pulled in properly too. And obviously, I showed you an example where the sites look completely different. That's pretty jarring. I think that normally you probably want them to be a little more branded.
Not necessarily. I mean, you have a microsite, right? If you have a site that part of it is documentation, that probably shouldn't look like the rest of your site, which is more marketing or brochure wise.
Yeah, right? And from an SEO perspective, you might want to have that under the same domain. So.
Yeah, or if you have an e-commerce section of your site, maybe you want that to be branded differently too.
Agreed.
So I think you can one way or the other.
And so there's also CDN cache rules that are now in play. So you can set up the CDN to actually just proxy it every time and never cache it. But I think that you should look at the caching of the CDN to say, well, how is this cached on the edge? Because there's a lot of value to having it cached on the edge. And if it's a static file, it's not going to change until the next build, so you're good. Right. But when that file does change, you need to think about how that cache gets cleared, which you can set up in your DevOps.
Right. So in the DevOps pipeline, that DevOps pipeline needs to be a little smarter, because it needs to think about, okay, what URLs on the CDN do I need to bust cache for? And it might even need to do things on your legacy site. So if your legacy site was never behind a CDN and now it is,
that's right.
You also need to make sure that if things change on your legacy site, that you also purge those sort of CDN, those cache CDN for that site as well.
So there's lots of different things to think about. Oftentimes for a legacy site, folks will just say, well, let's set it to like an hour for these pages and 2 minutes or 5 minutes for my homepage or something.
Right. So for simplicity, you're just like, okay, it'll just be cached for an hour and then it won't be. So the worst case scenario there is it may take like, depending on what you set that time limit to, it could just automatically expire at a certain time and it just gets a new version.
That's right. Yeah. So if the like privacy policy changes on my thing, it'll take up to an hour to change. But if it's on the homepage, it's every minute or something like that.
Right.
Anyway, there's lots of different ways to do that, but it's certainly a gotcha. You got to think about it. And the DNS rules can get interesting. So now we have, because like you have to point your DNS at a CDN, not at a web server. You have to think about that. So and if you don't have control of the DNS in your organization, you're certainly going to need to communicate with those folks.
Yeah. So if you're taking an existing site, you're putting behind a CDN, you got to change some DNS records at some point, right? Yeah.
DNS will be involved.
Okay.
Usually, that often it's a blocker. So it's something where I don't want to talk about DNS too often because people will shut me down. IT will say, I don't want to talk about DNS, or that person doesn't work here anymore or something, which sometimes happens. It's one of those things you want to bring into the conversation after you sold the concept.
Right.
That's what I believe. So yeah, that's pretty much all the education I think we can pack in. We went a little bit over time, but I'm pretty happy with it.
We're actually right on time.
We want to talk about some other events that are coming up because this is an ongoing conversation. We haven't had any questions, so we're just going to keep on pressing forward. There's a JAMstack Toronto meetup group that meets every month.
I'm there pretty much every time. I know you've gone a couple times as well. I actually did a talk where I talked about the importance of the editor experience while building Jamstack sites to a bunch of people who are already building Jamstack sites and things at the meetup that was a few weeks ago. So if you're curious to learn more about Jamstack and want to connect with other developers and you want to chat with me in person, come to the Jamstack Toronto meetup. The next one's March 19th. I personally won't be there, going for my honeymoon, but the following one in April is actually one that it looks like Agility CMS will be sponsoring that one. So it's tentative for April, not confirmed yet, but follow at Jamstack Toronto on Twitter for announcements and upcoming events. Yep.
Yeah, it's a great meetup. And it's a group that's growing really, really fast. So pretty exciting to see that sort of move forward. The day after that is an FITC spotlight on Jamstack. So this is a sort of a group that they do a lot of conferences, and this is a one-day event coming up on the 20th. I will be speaking about Jamstack there as well, but also folks from Gatsby will be there, and some other great presenters. So check that out.
Nullify, I'll be there. Yep. I can't remember some of the other ones now, but
me either.
You'll be there.
I will be there presenting, and it's a really, really great day, really great chance to network with a bunch of people.
You're doing a talk actually, and where you're gonna actually expand on this similar concept.
Yeah. Well, I was learning all the things from you today about this talk, so now I'm going to take what came out of your brain and sort of try and remember some of those things. I will be watching the YouTube video again. So that's coming up on the 20th. Our next webinar, we're going to change the format a little bit. We're going to do, I really like this back and forth, the talking, we're actually in the same room. So we're going to be doing a tutorial on using Gatsby with Agility CMS. We're going to dive directly into Gatsby.
Yeah, I've talked, like at our previous webinar, I did talk a little bit about Gatsby and just like very high level how a few things work, but this one we'll actually want to do a much deeper dive into, so it'll be a lot more developer focused on, the exact how-tos of getting started with your local environment, changing some code, building some new modules in the CMS, seeing how that works with your code, and setting up a preview environment. So that'll be something where I'll be teaching you how to do this stuff, and you guys can watch or actually code along with us.
Yeah, well, I'd like to really set this up so that we can, we'll send you some messaging ahead of time so that you can set up your environments to kind of code along with us, to sort of see how it actually works, or you can just sit back and watch and drink some coffee. So that's the next webinar. We really want to continue the conversation with folks. So check out our community page. There's the ability to join our Slack channel and to see our GitHub repos, because all the stuff we do is open source now.
We have some pretty cool stuff now out there on the GitHub repo. We have some new things that are coming up that have been up there now, are updates to our starter site for Gatsby. So we made some significant updates in how quickly those builds happen. We also released a Agility Sync SDK
for JavaScript.
Which its job there is specifically to act as an interface to be able to grab content from Agility and store that in some local manner to cache it. We're actually using that in our Gatsby source plugin to store things into GraphQL. But you can also use that just to store local JSON files. So if you are using a different static site generator and you want to be able to synchronize content in an efficient manner, you can use that library and extend it. We also have some updates to our Agility CMS Next.js starter template as well that now supports static site generation. And we're looking to make improvements to that still. So yeah, lots of exciting things. I encourage you guys to join our Agility CMS community on the Slack channel. It's a perfect opportunity to connect with other developers that are using Agility right now and building projects. It's also just a really easy way to get in touch with us if you want to ask questions. As an alternative to emailing support. But of course, you have something urgent, email support.
Cool. And coming up is Agility Days. So this is actually, we actually advertised it on the last one as it being in May. We pushed this to June. So right now the dates are June 25th and 26th. So it's a 2-day event that's coming up. That's basically it's our summit for customers and partners and developers that are interested in sort of getting into agility. So check out our community page for that as well. There's a sign up that's actually live. It's on Eventbrite, so you can sign up for that one as of today. Of course, every conference is now under sort of the, well, what are you going to do about the coronavirus and about, are you going to actually have a conference? So we're seeing some conferences sort of slide and move out. Some have been canceled completely. Yeah. We haven't canceled Agility Days at this point, but as always, sort of keep in touch. We'll be in touch with you folks, especially if someone signs up today. Obviously, we want you to sign up now to sort of show interest in this. We definitely want to move forward with Agility Days. So at this point, it's still on. If we end up moving to something else, we'll do something virtual probably.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, one way or another, this event's going off, whether it's in person or virtual.
Yeah, so we're really excited about this as a 2-day event. It's going to be the culmination of a lot of work and a lot of sort of learning that's happened over the past sort of year to bring a lot of these ideas out there from both a digital leadership point of view. And so there's a whole track just for digital leaders, the CTOs, the VPs, the directors of whatever, but also a track for developers. Yeah. And as always, we want to continue the conversation. So follow us on Twitter at Agility CMS. Check out the website, get on that community page. But if you are a digital leader, if you just want to say, I want to get Jamstack in my website right now, or start talking about that, email our sales at agilitycms.com. We want to start having more conversations with people about that from the sales point of view to say, how can we get this into your organization and help you out with that?